Good morning and happy holidays from the Jamestown Foundation. Um, Again, thank you all for your time and your attention, your consideration, and your support for the Jamestown Foundation, our analysts' work, and really trying to help Americans understand the world in the terms and the concepts of our adversaries, so that it's their words, their understanding, not Americans and not Western Europeans trying to push their views onto systems that we don't necessarily understand or that we haven't grown up in. And I think we're particularly honored today to have one of Jamestown's senior fellows, Janusz Bugajski, speaking to us about Poland today. He is the author of the forthcoming Pivotal Poland. We have a galley here that will be, finished and off on the presses very, very shortly, and we'll do a formal launch in the new year. But he's someone who has looked at Poland at this point for, I want to say 40 years in a variety of capacities as Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, as
Mhm.
director of European programs at the Center for Strategic International Studies. And he's just been a prolific contributor and supporter of Jamestown, with several books to his name, looking at Russia, looking at Poland, and really keeping an eye on the future. He's not looking at the past. He's not doing journalism. He's really looking at the current moment and looking at the way that things go forward. And so I wanted to talk with Janusz today because last week when I was in Rome for a G7 conference on the sort of the intersection of hybrid threats and nuclear deterrence, which Russia so ably exemplifies, if you will, as a threat to European security on both fronts. A number of the government participants from the Italian Foreign Ministry, the sort of scholarly and analytic participants from Germany, France, the UK, from Italy, the United States, all had questions about, where does Poland stand? Where is Poland going? What are the choices that we're going to make? And I couldn't think of a better person to answer this question, like, why is Poland important today than Janusz? So if you could if help people understand, like, why it's not just some country in the center of Europe, like that maybe we remember because of the solidarity protests or because of Rumsfeld's New Europe and Old Europe. Uh, why should we look at Poland today on its own terms, and why is it important to us?
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Peter. So happy the book is about to be published. I have been watching, I'm not as young as 40, I've been watching Poland all my life, so very closely, from emigre side, but also internally in terms of what is going on. I would say this, I would say at this very critical juncture in European and world history, a lot of unpredictability, a lot of uncertainties about the future, a lot more conflicts than we had during the Cold War in many respects, even in the heart of Europe. Uh, Poland is basically a rising power. It has a lot of ambitions to become one of the leaders of NATO, one of the leaders of the European Union. It is actually, I would say, the American anchor in continental Europe, with Germany, France, and others distancing themselves or not fulfilling the sort of obligations they have under NATO. I think Poland is now emerging, as I say in the book, as the pivotal power, both for Europe but also for the United States. It's also, remember, very important, the largest frontline state facing an increasingly aggressive Russia. It views itself in many respects as being in a permanent war with Russia, even though that war is not always conventional. But there's always a conflict, and the Russians see it exactly the same way. Also, I would say, to answer your question, why is it important? It's the largest country in Central Eastern Europe. It has a population of more or less 38 million citizens. It's also taking its security and its neighbors' security very seriously. We can come back to this, allocating over 4% of its GDP to defense. It has the third largest army in NATO after the United States and Turkey. And it's also pursuing a number of very important regional programs. It stands as sort of crossroads of Central Europe. Number of regional programs to enhance economic development, infrastructure, interconnectivity, and security between Northern, Central, and Southeast Europe. For instance, the Three Seas Initiative, which is becoming a major economic and not just economic, but also security project in Europe. So I will put it this way: in sum, I mean, Poland has an ambition to be the economic and security hub of continental Europe. And in terms of its spending, in terms of its actions, it seems to be delivering on that aspiration.
I think another question that kind of immediately comes up, just in terms of some of the day-to-day concerns and the issue of Russia's second invasion or sort of never-ending war against Ukraine. The, I mean, would it be possible to have provided the support to Ukraine without sort of or sort of without Poland's not just voluntary cooperation or acquiescence, but their sort of active participation and active support? And kind of looking ahead, if we arrive at that day where Ukrainian reconstruction is a real possibility,
Mhm.
that is, not about sort of building things or maintaining things under threat of missile fire and glide bombs and the like. How important is Poland sort of to both of these efforts today and in the future?
Well, very good question. I mean, Poland has been critical to Ukraine's survival during this war, during this extended war by Russia. It supplied not only did it supply most of its old Soviet era equipment, which is still effective, of course, in the kind of war we're witnessing in Ukraine, but also it became the hub of all major munitions and equipment going through Poland to Ukraine. Um, in the future, of course, Poland does want to position itself as the major power for help in the reconstruction of Ukraine. In other words, not just a military hub, but also an economic hub for Ukraine. I think the war has done one other thing, which is very important, which is to bring the Ukrainian and Polish people much closer together. It hasn't always been a happy history between the two countries. In fact, if you remember, a third of what's now Ukraine used to be part of the Second Polish Republic. So there is a history of conflict in the past, but I think it's remarkable how the two countries and the two governments have come together because of the common enemy. Poland, as I said, is going to be one of the key countries, if not the key country, for the reconstruction of Ukraine. But even in the shorter term, I would say it's going to be absolutely critical in the defense of Ukraine.
So let's kind of move away from the bigger issues and to the people. How do Poland's leaders today look at the world? How do they, what do they see when they look out at Europe, when they look at, when they look to the east at Belarus, at Russia, at Ukraine? Because in many ways, we're now beyond the, I wouldn't say that we're beyond the solidarity generation, but that effort was, what does it mean to be an independent Poland, to be an independent nation, free of Soviet domination? And how do we build this new independent Poland in Europe, in a world that is, beyond the Cold War? And I
Mhm.
recognize that this is there were plenty of people who were perhaps a little older than I was, but who are now kind of hitting the peak of their careers and would be in important positions. But it
Mhm.
seems like the political lines are not about this sort of old guard that is kind of emerging from a communist shell and trying to figure out what to do with themselves, and not a solidarity generation that's figuring out, but like that there can be a more organic politics, if you will, about Poland and finding its way forward that's not burdened by that history.
Right. Well, let me start with the solidarity generation or generations. I mean, this was one phase of uh, fighting and overthrowing communism at the time, but it was not simply a question for that generation or generation since of communism. I mean, communism was an interlude. A much bigger problem for Poland over many generations has been Russian imperialism. We see this today in Ukraine. We see this today in Belarus. We see this today in the constant threats against the Baltic states. In other words, all generations, I would say, in Poland are brought up to view the threat from Moscow as being somewhere in the background, but can rise again at any time. And, if you remember in the post-Cold War era, the sort of what is it, the benefits that the West Europeans thought they would gain from the end of the Cold War, Poland was warning right from the outset, and continued to, that the danger from the east hadn't receded, and particularly after Russia became much more aggressive in Ukraine, in Georgia, Moldova, and elsewhere. Poland, unfortunately, their leaders were accused of being Russophobes, as with the Baltic states, but were proved correct. How do they view the world now? I would say with increasing confidence in standing up and defending their independence. Um, Lingering suspicion, I would say, of the West European countries, particularly Germany and France, that they would actually come to Poland's defense. And there's a lot of history behind that as well, as you can, if you remember World War II. And also a sort of view of America as wanting to be as close to America as possible, but understanding increasingly, I would say, the differences and the I would say the ideological and policy differences within the US political establishment that will affect Poland, and trying to cope with that, trying to come to terms with that, and try to be the best ally for America, whatever administration is in place. So that is a sort of major challenge, I would say, now and moving forward through the next 4 years.
So, we talked a little bit about the Cold War and some of this transition. What do you think are, before we bring up the question of Russian imperialism again, um, what do you think are some of the other elements of Poland's journey to the present after the end of the Cold War? That they've sort of come to these realizations. What are perhaps some key moments in this journey?
Yeah, well, people say that communism fell, Sovietism fell with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. It didn't. It actually fell with the birth of Solidarity, which was a nationwide movement which overthrew communism. They held the first, remember, Poland was the first to hold democratic elections in 1989, 1990. It was the first to transform its institutions, to conduct very rapid economic reforms that transformed a planned communist economy into a free market. That was a remarkable achievement. So in some countries, that process still hasn't been completed. The Polish economy now is one of the biggest in the European Union. It's certainly the largest of all the former Soviet bloc economies that joined the European Union. It's rebounded very impressively after the COVID-19 pandemic. Even during that time, Polish economy registered a steady growth. It's becoming an investment hub. This is very important to remember that in the case of Poland, it's a safe environment for investment. It's a good environment for profit, not only from European countries, but from the US, from Japan, and other major economies around the world. In fact, the World Bank is now projecting that Poland's what's called the purchasing power parity, which compares sort of economic productivity and standard of living, is likely to exceed that of Japan by 2026. I mean, this would have been unimaginable 20 to 30 years ago. Standard of living is now higher than it is in some of the Southern European countries. A lot of the Polish workers that emigrated or migrated to Britain, Ireland, and other West European countries are coming home because jobs are better, the country's safer, the climate is more conducive to development. So in all these metrics, I would say Poland has been a leader. Many others, I mean, energy diversity, I think Poland was at the head of that, weaning itself away from Russia. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, on the military side.
So how did Russia's invasions of its former republics, Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, and as I recall, there were a number of sort of fairly severe incidents like Estonia in, I want to say, 2006,
Mhm.
that became very public about what Russia was doing. How did those affect the Poles' sort of view of security? Was it simply a reinforcement? Was it to the Western Europeans, we've been telling you so? How did this alter Polish perceptions and behavior in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Poland had been warning, and as I mentioned earlier, Polish governments of all persuasions have been warning West European leaders that Russia's re-imperialization seemed to be gathering steam. We saw this in Georgia, we saw this in Ukraine. And remember, Poland was very supportive of the democratic revolutions in Georgia, the Rose Revolution, where Polish leaders went into Tbilisi expressed full support, full solidarity with the new government. Similarly in Ukraine during the Orange Revolution and during the Maidan. So the Polish leaders have been at the forefront, whatever the political persuasions internally, at the forefront of helping these countries, of pursuing democratic reforms, enabling them to reform their institutions. They've also been at the forefront of the Eastern Partnership, in other words, to bring the European Union closer to these former Soviet republics. And of course, NATO membership. Even a couple of days ago, Premier Tusk in Lviv met with Zelensky and said very clearly that if Poland if Poland fully led NATO, then Ukraine would be a member by tomorrow. In other words, they are at the forefront of trying to bring both Georgia and Ukraine, have been for many years, into the alliance. I think Russia's invasions, those two that you mentioned, they confirm Polish fears and Polish explanations to the West. They also exposed the deficiencies of West European policy towards Russia. And they underscored that rearmament and NATO enlargement policies were basically correct. Because why is it that Russia didn't go for the Baltic states? I think the primary reason, the Poles argue this very clearly, is that they became NATO members, and Russia did not want to risk a full frontal confrontation with NATO in which America would be involved. Those would be, I would say, the major Polish responses to those events.
So, is there, right, you described a Poland that's growing in confidence, growing in capability, a sense of purpose and arriving on the scene, and no longer perhaps being in awe of some of its neighbors. It helps when your neighbors are wrong about some big things, and you can say, "I told you so," even if it doesn't actually make the situation better. So, but what is still missing, do you think, from Poland's sort of foreign and national security policy making? Is it something where, we've seen, sort of a fully formed statue, everything's been chiseled out, or is there still some really big issues that have to be sorted inside the Polish establishment?
Yeah, it's a process. The good news, I would say, let me start with the good news, then I'll look at some of the potential shortcomings. The good news is there is political consensus on foreign and security policy. That's across party lines. The major parties basically support the same approach towards military buildup, towards defending NATO, towards the alliance with the United States, etc., etc. And actually, they all agree with each other in terms of EU membership. Poland may be Eurosceptic on one side, but it's not anti-EU. It wants the EU to be a lot stronger in terms of its posture vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis the outside world, but it doesn't want a federal Europe. It doesn't want its decision-making taken away and given to Brussels. However, that there are some shortcomings, of course, in Poland, as in many countries, particularly, I would say, political polarization, partisan polarization. We see this in the United States. We see this in Poland. And that has, I would say, over time, it does erode or undermine trust in institutions, in information, in the media, and so forth. Whenever you have disputes over not just over policy, but over meaning, over position, over ethics, over morality, then you have, I think, it rots away a little bit of the political system. Luckily, I would say Poland has had, as we witnessed October 2023, Poland did have elections that were very free and fair, and power was given over to the winning party. There was no contestation that the elections were stolen, as in some other countries. So in that respect, I think it's very positive. But Poland faces challenges. There's always monetary challenges, financial challenges in terms of the budget, being able to have enough in the budget to spend on the military development that you have earmarked for the foreseeable future. Poland also has, as many other European countries, demographic challenges in terms of an aging population, not enough replenishment of, falling size of families, not enough replenishment of the workforce. In many respects, I would say the number, over 2 million Ukrainian refugees that came to Poland, have boosted the Polish economy. They've been a bonus for Polish service industry, for construction, infrastructure building, and so on and so forth. So it's, there's this idea that Poland is anti-immigrant. No, it's actually very open. It hosts probably one of the biggest immigrant populations of any country in Europe. And it's going to be important actually in terms of future economic growth or sustaining that economic growth. And of course, lastly, I would say Poland faces challenges that it has to respond to, urgent challenges. The regional impact of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, what's going to be the result of the war, particularly under the Trump administration, how that's going to affect Poland, whether it's going to strengthen Russia or weaken Russia, spillover effects from Russia itself in terms of its own internal problems. So all these potentially negative consequences Poles are continuously weighing and trying to respond to.
So, I guess should we be thinking, given your description, should we be thinking of Poland primarily as a European power, or one that might increasingly play something of a global role? How do you see it? How do you think Poland's leaders see this question?
Well, actually, it's a very good question. I think Poland's leaders increasingly compare themselves or compare Poland's strategic importance to that, for instance, of Japan or South Korea in the Pacific region. In other words, they see themselves as a major asset for the United States. They see themselves as a mid-level power that can have a major impact on curtailing and preventing nearby imperial powers from extending their reach. And I think it does underscore that medium-sized countries can play a crucial role in ensuring multi-regional security if they pay and if they play. In other words, if they pay for their defense and if they conduct the right policies that make them reliable allies. And this is precisely what Poland is trying to do. One other factor I think is very important in the case of Poland, and there's been debate about this in the country, that Poland has very good relations with a lot of the countries that we call part of the global South, where it is not perceived as a former colonial power, of course, unlike the French or or Spain or Portugal or others. And I think that's to Poland's benefit. And I think both Europe and America can stand to benefit from Poland's influence in several regions around the world. In other words, it's not only is it not a former colonial power, but it was a former colonized power. So, those relationships that Poland is cultivating, I think, can be enhanced much further.
So, to go back to a future orientation about this, if you're looking around the world, we've seen in the last year and probably in the year or two ahead, we have a lot of countries with big political choices, big elections looming on the horizon. Germany's political cohesion and what they look like going forward. What is a new ruling coalition?
Mhm.
We've certainly seen the signs in France. We're seeing, the collapse of a government in real time in Canada, uh, and so I think, one of those important things for us to be thinking about is not necessarily a prediction about what this future holds, but what are the indicators going in one direction or another, or what are big events that we should be looking out for over the horizon to say, when we see this thing approaching for us, we should start paying attention. What are the because I know that when you named the book Pivotal Poland, right, there were a lot of pivots that were critical to this. And I think this was the last one of what does this road ahead look like?
Yeah.
And how do we start understanding which direction, which pathway Poland is going to take?
Right. Well, not looking too far ahead, but just over the horizon. Very important event coming up in Poland, the presidential elections in the spring. And remember, President Duda, the current president, had and has very good relations with President Trump in the first administration. He's maintained those contacts ever since. It's good in many respects that as Trump comes into office, that Duda will be his interlocutor in Warsaw. And hopefully that transition, because Duda can't stand again for another election, hopefully that transition to a new president will firm up, would consolidate Poland's place as in the White House as a reliable partner, as a good interlocutor, as somewhere where Trump will feel at home if he goes to Warsaw, with the fact that Poland is meeting its obligations under NATO. It pledges to defend Europe, defend itself, defend America in case of attack. So, I mean, that is, I think, going to be the challenge. Who's going to be the new Polish president? What relationship he'll be able to establish with Trump? How he will be able to demonstrate that Poland will remain a dependable ally that is willing to spend and fight for its independence and the security of the transatlantic alliance. So on the immediate horizon, I would say that's it's not a challenge so much as a test, if you like, of the Polish-American relationship.
Well, look, thank you very much, Janusz, for that tour de force for understanding Poland today and what we should be looking at going ahead. I mean, it's really quite remarkable that even after seeing the ways in which Poland and the United States have cooperated over the last 30, 34, 35 years, that we still don't, as we don't necessarily see it as a South Korea or a Japan
Mhm.
or a UK or Australia type relationship, but it clearly, in fact and in reality has become something very near that. And as you put it, they pay and they play um, when it comes to the alliance with the United States. So thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to hosting you again in the new year when we launch your book officially and make sure that everyone gets a copy of it. And again, thank you again for all of your work that you've done for Jamestown over the years.
Thank you, Peter, and happy and productive New Year to everyone.